Good afternoon, everyone. This is Yvette Kelly with the McSilver Institute along with the Community Technical Assistance Center, Managed Care Technical Assistance Center, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, which is an offering under our multi-platform online series entitled 0 Degrees of Separation, the Role of Social Determinants. For those of you who are new to this series, the McSilver Institute, CTAC, and MCTAC have partnered to launch this multi-platform series to help clinical professionals, community health workers, educators, policymakers think critically about those social factors that have a direct and indirect impact on an individual's health and mental health. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to orient everyone to the WebEx system so you know how to participate in today's event. Please note that upon joining the webinar, you have been placed on mute to avoid any background noises that may distract others from listening to the presentation today. If you come across any technical issues during today's event, please chat to the host, Brianna, who should be able to assist you. You will have the opportunity to submit questions for the Q&A portion of today's presentation by utilizing the chat box feature, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen. If it's not visible, please click the dialog bubble on the top right toolbar and it should appear. In order to ensure that we are able to answer as many questions as time permits, we are requesting that you send in your questions at any point during the webinar, and we will address them during the Q&A portion of today's event. Today's webinar, Promoting Nutrition Education in Diverse Populations, will discuss the social, cultural, and economic factors that have an influence on people's food habits and choices and identify culturally sensitive strategies to improve nutrition among diverse populations. We are very pleased to have Dr. Psyche Williams-Forreston with us today. Psyche is an associate professor and chair at the University of Maryland. She's an affiliate faculty member of the Women's and African American Studies Department and the Consortium on Race, Gender, and Ethnicity. Her research and teaching interests include cultural studies, material culture, food, women's studies, and social and cultural history of the U.S. in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Her work on material culture and food has been published in her books, Taking Food Public, Redefining Foodways in a Changing World, and the award-winning Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs, Black Women, Food, and Power, where she examines the complexities of Black women's legacies using food as a form of cultural work. Psyche is a recipient of several teaching awards, including one from the Foxworth Creative Enterprise Initiative that encourages faculty and students to enter into a collaborative learning and working relationship with an underrepresented community, and the Academy for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, which uses design thinking activities to address food insecurity in Prince George's County, Maryland. A noted expert in the field of food culture, we will now turn it over to Psyche for today's presentation.
Great, thank you, Yvette, and welcome and good afternoon to all of you. I'm delighted and happy to have the opportunity to talk just a little bit about some of the issues, social, cultural, economic, and political regarding food and food cultures. And I should share right off the bat that I am coming at this discussion primarily from a cultural point of view, and also that I use African American communities as one case study from which I think we can build out and open up the dialogue around these issues of food and health, food insecurity, and the like. So I want to start this afternoon by asking you to consider that this is your house, okay? Just take a moment and visualize this is a swell living space. And so imagine that you have returned to your home, and once you go in, so you're familiar with where everything is. There's the sofa, there's table, the kitchen, and so forth. But on this particular occasion, I want you to imagine that something is missing. A part of your house is gone. Little by little, you see that things have disappeared. And then right before your eyes, other things start to disappear, until all that remains is literally a sliver of what made your house a home. I ask you to begin with this and imagine what your emotions might be. perhaps dazed and confused. What's going on? My world seems to be evaporating right in front of me. But most likely, I imagine you might be scared, angry, frustrated, resentful, and also rebellious. I think this is often what happens when we go into communities with the best of intentions as educators, as healthcare workers, and so forth, healthcare professionals. We go into people's rooms, if you will, in the hospital, and we say, hey, you know, how you feeling? How's it going? And then ultimately we get around to, you need to change your diet. And that tends to be the phraseology. You need to change your diet. And amidst everything else, people are trying to process what it is that you're sharing with them about the life change, this tremendous life change that they have to make. I started with the house metaphor and imagery because I want us to today, for the next few moments, and going forward, to think about food as a set of objects. We tend to disassociate, I think, food from the fact that it is like any other object, set of objects in our homes or in our lives. Food is like clothing, right? Food is like speech. Food is like the shoes we wear, our cell phones. Food is very similar to that. So when you take that away from us or you change it, people sometimes, and more often than not, in my research experience, want to hold on even tighter. I perform an exercise with a group of students when I teach a course on food trauma and sustainability. I teach an exercise where, in order to build empathy with the populations that we are about to engage, I have the students go through a simulation experience, and I say, show up to I put this on the syllabus, and I say, I want you to show up to a particular place at this time. Normally, it's a classroom. And I said, you don't have to eat because we're going to provide lots of food. And when they get there, the very first thing I do is I give them a Ziploc bag, and I said, put your name on this and give me your cell phone. And I mean, the sheer discomfort that students express help me to even better understand how much more we're talking when you take away something as basic as food. So again, I want us to think about this because food then, like objects, help us to order our world, right? As a set of objects, it helps us to make sense of our lives. That's why we have this notion of comfort food, right? Because there's certain foods that you can eat or smell or taste, and they immediately bring you back to a set of experiences, to practices, to heritages, to meanings. So move today away from food as an abstract in people's lives to something that's very germane, very much more than nutrition, more than all of those things. It also conjures up a constellation of feelings, of emotions, so forth and so on. So part of what I want us to also think about is how the social and cultural significance about food is grounded both in science and justified in terms of their impact on our health, but also it's grounded, again, in culture, and it's grounded in the subjective, the emotions. The last several decades, we've heard a lot about how food and science are very much intertwined. At the same time, again, we continue to think about dietary ideals as objective. And we fail, I think, sometimes to recognize that food is also ideological. We have, as my colleagues have written, my colleagues and I have written, we have ceded the terrain of eating right to scientific and medical epistemologies. Even though history and culture can teach us a lot about food, we tend to only put it, or we privilege the scientific elements without thinking through the other elements that history can teach us. Charlotte Biltikoff, who is a food studies scholar, has said that she often wonders what it would mean for a conversation about food and health to be based on a fundamental belief that our most common sense ideas about health, good diets, and good eaters are actually shaped by culture. They're actually shaped by our values. And to some extent, of course, science-oriented studies on food and health include a lot of this. But when we consider that health is a medical matter that takes place within culture, then we can begin to think, too, that sometimes culture can get in the way of healthy eating. Biltikoff says, and I have here, if we bother with this at all, that is this work of food studies or food transformations, we may as well start to imagine a new way of thinking that starts from the premise that dietary health cannot be thought of from purely medical or scientific perspectives. Dietary health cannot, of course, be thought purely from a cultural perspective either. Biltikoff goes on to say, so talking about food is going to require some very radical, productively unsettling conversation, collaboration, and cross-fertilization across social, disciplinary, and professional divides. Usually it's at this point where I share with people that there are, to my way of thinking and from my research, no easy one-size-fits-all answers. That's not what I'm hoping to do today. Rather, what I would like to do is to help you think a little differently about how we might approach concerns we have around food, but also to think about this as an ongoing, multifaceted conversation from the top up, from the bottom down. There are so many different layers, and I want us to not think through the entire constellation, but to recognize that such a constellation does exist. As I said, my interest here is in food as a part of cultural sustainability. When we hear the term sustainability, which we hear a lot of today, we usually think in terms of the three pillars or what is known as the triple bottom line. We think about people and the social aspects. We think about our planet, of course, all the environmental aspects, and we think about, perhaps for those in this industry, profit or the financial aspects. But in focusing only on those three pillars, I think we miss an important variable in this discussion of sustainability, and one that affects most of our lives, and including migrants and transmigrants. This limited focus, I think, that is excluding the fourth pillar of sustainability, leads us to assume that what is good for some is good for all. So, for example, I often encounter people who say things like, eating local is best, or, I do farmers markets, or biodiversity is where we should be going, and so forth and so on. And that, it seems to me, misses the element of cultural sustainability. Let's take a look at this definition here. Culture, as the fourth pillar of sustainability, is a key premise in this discussion, and according to UNESCO in 2001, they say cultural diversity is as necessary for humankind as biodiversity is for nature. It becomes one of the roots of development, understood not simply in terms of economic growth, but also as a means to achieve a more satisfactory intellectual, emotional, moral, and spiritual existence. And I think that's very, very important, because it again goes back to our house that was rapidly before our eyes. And we ask, how does the work that we do enable or assist people in achieving a more satisfactory intellectual, emotional, moral, and spiritual existence around something as benign, if you will, as food? So I want to share with you for the next couple of moments a case study that I have built a lot of this discussion around, and just to kind of open up the conversation a bit and think a little bit about how we might see some of the challenges, but also how we might embrace some of those challenges. So in 2008, the Washington Post wrote a 5-part expose titled Young Lives at Risk, Our Overweight Children. And one of the exposés that caught my eye involved a 12-year-old girl named Latricia Avery. She was a part of the visual gallery, so you were able to see many of the images, and so you'll see I'm sharing those with you now. Latricia at the time was 12, and she was 5'7" and weighed 220 pounds. And again, these are some of the images from the gallery. Much of the online portion of Latricia's story deals with the ways in which she was teased in school regarding not only her weight, but also her height and her skin tone. So she felt isolated and alone in school. And we're seeing some of this, interestingly, right now with Leslie Jones and her character with Ghostbusters. But Latricia is a tall, rapidly becoming full-figured young girl. Okay, and so at times she was called King Kong and other kinds of maybe derogatory names. At home, Latricia says she turns, in the expose, she says she turns to food. Foods like fried chicken, macaroni and cheese, collard greens, to deal with what she says is her depression. Her grandmother, at the time of the expose, her grandmother had recently died. And so, you know, we see here Latricia, or the hands of whom is supposed to be Latricia, with a sweet potato, maybe it looks like potato salad, macaroni and cheese, collard greens, chicken, and other foods, corn pudding, right here, corn pudding. And then off to the side is a really large, what looks like a pound cake or a multi-layer cake, rather. Okay, so as I read the print and the digital versions of Latricia's story, my training as an American Studies scholar who works at the intersection of gender, race, and food helped me to begin to think that Latricia is not eating in a vacuum. Her article, while the article framed the issue as a problem of appetite pretty much alone, I saw something different. Latricia, it seemed to me, eats to a point where she is at risk of death because in many ways I thought death surrounded her. Her grandmother had just died. She lives in and is told constantly that she lives in a food desert, you know, because she lives in a neighborhood where there are corner stores and liquor stores and so forth. So Latricia is pretty much living in a place where she's surrounded by death. Cultural perspectives are often, I think, considered an afterthought in discussions of food policy and nutrition education. Why, when stories like Latricia so readily reveal the close connection between what people eat and what kind of lives they live, are we not seeing a connection there? So how can we in food and culture encourage those who seek to help people like Latricia, who operate on the side of science and policy, better understand the impact of environment and culture on their food behaviors? There are a number of organizations already doing this, and in fact, what you will see in one of the forthcoming slides is they engaged a project called Project Health FitNut to actually help girls and people like Latricia. This was a weekly after-school program for girls aged 8 to 12, and it provided a supportive environment in which girls can grow up with health knowledge and confidence. So one of the questions I ask is, how can we fill the gap between what community-based interventions operate around our food supply and those that may need to be individually tailored toward people like Latricia? Can a greater awareness of culture and cultural beliefs help, especially in preventing the ill health that is said to be associated primarily with African Americans, and that is obesity, diabetes, hypertension, and the like? Now, in the photo gallery and the slideshow that accompanies Avery's story, we find one clip that shows Latricia with a really, well, first of all, we see her struggling here to make weight, if you will, to make a lower weight. Emphasis is placed on her personal responsibility, her need to exercise willpower and so forth. Her aunt says she's just not doing enough. Okay, so we have these organizations, like I said, like FitNut and so forth. But at one point in the gallery, we see this image right here, which is one of my favorite, because what it shows is this young girl is faced with this salad, and she's picking out raw broccoli. Okay, so she's got this salad of tomato, cucumber, slice of red pepper, raw broccoli, a scoop of tuna salad. And when you compare this to what Latricia tends to eat, which are foods like fried fish or chicken, macaroni and cheese, collard greens, and corn pudding, it's a very, especially from a cultural point of view and one of familiarity, it's a huge leap to ask her to leave this in favor of this. While it might seem like that's the thing we want her to do, that's a huge shift for anyone, and especially for a child. Eating foods from this menu, also known as soul food in many African American communities, is part of a cultural tradition that is directly tied to our families and communities. So if, in fact, we embrace that, then I would ask, which of these options perhaps would you choose as an adult? And certainly, how much more, as I said, would a child choose that option? But given that, I ask us then to consider that food has a lot of heavy lifting to do. Kimberly Nettles argues in her article, Saving Soul Food, and I think this is a really good point. She said, if food itself is the culprit, then the answer is to simply stop consuming it. Yet the threat of disease and death fails to quell the urge to prepare and consume foods that are part of a cultural tradition, foods that are valued as positive parts of our communal life. The plethora of light soul food cookbooks that we now have, everyone from Patti LaBelle to just, other folks from different regions who have light soul food cookbooks. This plethora attempt to save soul food by encouraging the retelling of narratives that honor family, love, and community, while simultaneously advocating personal responsibility and restraint. Even so, these cookbooks do not go far enough. They pay very little attention to the problems that are endemic to our contemporary food system that contribute to disease and environmental degradation. So context in this case really does matter, because it's not always that food alone is the culprit. Many food enthusiasts and activists ask, what about obesity among African Americans? And I get this question a lot. They're like, but what about obesity? But what we sometimes don't realize is many cultures suffer from obesity, and that region is as big a culprit as anything else. When you think about the stroke belt, yes, you have a number of African Americans and now rapidly moving in Latino cultures as well, but you also have other community groups as well that live in the stroke belt. So it can't only be that this is applicable to African American people. So there have been some folks who have argued that we do have to consider context. One of those people is Eric Oliver, who's a political scientist at the University of Chicago. And he said American recent weight gains have been widely described as an obesity epidemic. But this characterization has a lot of problems. Oliver and others go on to argue that the average American weight gain has been relatively low over the last 20 years, and that the causal linkages between adiposity, morbidity, mortality are unclear. But the media and health officials continue to sound dire warnings that obesity is an epidemic disease. In the article below, The Politics of Pathology, Oliver argues and examines how and why America's growing weight became an obesity epidemic. And so part of what he argues is that characterizations of food directly being tied to obesity are somewhat problematic. And he says the disease characterization has less to do with the health consequences of excess weight and more with the various financial and political incentives of the weight loss industry, medical profession, and public health bureaucracy. In addition to Eric Oliver, Paul Campos, who's a professor at the University of Colorado, maintains that we are in the midst of a moral panic. He calls upon deeply flawed epidemiological arguments about the dangers of obesity and the ways that they lend credibility to such scientifically baseless claims. He said the available scientific data neither support alarmist claims about obesity nor justify diverting scarce resources away from far more pressing public health issues. And he also suggests that there's a limited scientific evidence for the claims that there's a direct tie, if you will, between food consumption and obesity. He said, we suggest, and that is he and his co-authors, that the current rhetoric about an obesity-driven health crisis is being driven more by cultural and political factors than by any threat increasing body weight may pose to the public health. This same argument, and I won't belabor it, but it's been also looked at from the standpoint of physical anthropology. Clarence Grabley, who's a well-known anthropologist, maintains that a growing body of evidence establishes the primacy of social inequalities in the origin and persistence of racial health disparities. Racial inequality becomes embodied literally in the biological well-being of racialized groups and individuals. And so he says this model or this thought requires a shift in the way we articulate the critique of race as bad biology. And then lastly, I want to call on epidemiologist Nancy Krieger, who argues that other examples can readily be found, including 19th and early 20th century research, adducing that racial discrimination at any economic level can harm health among African Americans, above and beyond, but also compounding socioeconomic deprivation brought about by such discrimination. She says the socioeconomic gradient in health exists, extending from top to bottom ranks of society, not simply a poverty threshold that separates those with awful versus good health. And context and level matter. Poor people living in poor neighborhoods are likely to have poor health than equally poor people living in more affluent neighborhoods. Even with all of that said, back to Latricia, some of the points that they are making are applicable in the sense that we want food to do all the work without having to consider environment, without having to consider day-to-day, what we now are referring to as microaggressions, but day-to-day encounters with gender discrimination, racial discrimination, cultural discrimination, and so forth, as if these things do not also have a bearing on the ways in which we move and engage society. So again, context does matter in these situations, and creating healthy bodies, I think, requires a redefinition of the food stories that define our cultures. So one of the things that I advocate that we do or consider when we're doing this work are the ways in which we have conversations with people around changing food habits. Yanina Pepino, who's a research professor at the Washington School of Medicine, says taste is the most resilient of our senses, and no two people taste things the same way. If we remember that taste can evoke a series of emotions and desires, and that food and food customs are carriers of these emotions, they're also carriers of identity, memory, and tradition, then I think we might do well to think about discouraging one another from demonizing and degrading the foods that help to create and sustain people's communities. I hear all the time and have heard for the last 10 years or so as I've traveled throughout the country and internationally, but you know, soul food is bad for you. But we say that with very flippantly without realizing that we are talking about a particular cultural dynamic that was born out of a particular political moment, actually, and that has gone on throughout time. More than sustenance, food and rituals and customs as ingredients and in processes of preparation are symbolic for what they convey about our racial and ethnic identities. The ability to access recognizable foods can be as challenging for people like Latricia as it can be for college students who are away from home for the first time or migrants to this country. So how then do we help someone like Latricia to become healthy or to begin to develop healthy ways of eating without encouraging her to completely give up her corn pudding, collard greens, macaroni and cheese in favor of the naturally fresh salad? It is my contention that it should not have to be either or, but we should be talking in terms of and but. So some of the suggestions, I think, are to encourage culturally relevant foods, greens of all sorts, onions, tomatoes, butter beans and corn, apples, carrots, spinach, green pepper, okra, and so forth. In African American communities, at least, these are some of the foods that become very noticeable. Trying to suggest that people go to a farmer's market and where things like kohlrabi are going to be are for sale, or grass-fed beef for, you know, almost $20 a pound or what have you, is not going to be culturally relevant. These are the kinds of foods that you might want to suggest to those who have farmers market if they want to be inclusive of a variety of cultures. Here's an illustration of how a healthy meal can be good for you. You've got okra and beans, peas and rice with lots of colors, some greens, and so forth. These are, again, foods that are taken from the African heritage diet pyramid, but they're foods that are culturally familiar and culturally relevant. Again, part of what I want us to think about is rejecting an either-or dichotomy, but rather think in terms of how we can enable Latricia to have sweet potato pie, maybe just not as much of sweet potato pie. In other words, you don't have to have a whole pie, but you can have certainly some of that. So we encourage culturally familiar and different, not always better ways of cooking. We might need to change our language. In other words, you might have to do a little bit more research to figure out or find what particular spices will work: nutmeg, salt, pepper, vinegar, raw sugar instead of white sugar. There's nothing necessarily inherently wrong with salt, but it's when salt becomes excessive. What other kinds of seasonings can we include that will give you a flavor of salt? This corrective is far from simple, and I'll be the first to say that. It involves voices from a point of reason, humanistic voices, food policy voices, individuals, and communities. And again, I want to go back to what I said earlier. There's no one formula for everyone, nor can there be. So we would like to think in terms of broadening our conversation. I also want to dispel the myth that African Americans aren't interested in gardening, for example. We have some wonderful African American gardeners out there of all ages who readily will share with you the wonderful foods that they have grown in order to create what we might, again, see as culturally relevant foods. It is not so much that we don't want to eat healthy foods, but it's when we say to people, you cannot, you have to do away with this, or you have to change this, that, and the other. So I'm really advocating here for doing away with the moral certitude that one definition of healthy eating without taking into consideration a range of issues is better than another type of eating. The range of issues we have to consider are freedom, taste, affordability, access, knowledge, health, and we also have to consider how race as a process emerges through things like agricultural practices. We need to consider how growing vegetables in specific ways and agricultural decisions and methods and techniques that growers use and their encounters at the market, how all of these things affect people, how you have access to land and labor and credit and so forth and so on. All of that factors into food. I'm working on a project right now where I actually advocate for dollar stores. And if time permitted, I'd show you some of those images, because dollar stores are often a place where people can get quick kinds of foods: juice, milk, eggs, some fresh vegetables. And yet we put such a stigma on many of these locations and places, and so it makes it very difficult for people to want to branch out. I also want to conclude by saying that I'm very much aware that not all foods are cooked healthily. People wouldn't eat them often, even if they were. My point is that we don't need to buy lock, stock, and barrel into the misleading picture of food and agriculture that are constantly fed by those who want to regulate what we eat. Food policies sometimes are distorted. And when we pass that on to our clients, when we pass that on to those with whom we work, we kind of give them the baby with the bathwater scenario. It's an either-or prospect. But the reality is that our lives and our cultures are composed of many overlapping stories. And I want to conclude with leaving you just with this one point, and it's taken from novelist Adichie Chimamanda, who argues that there's danger in a single story. When we hear only a single story, or we perpetuate a single story about a person, about a culture, about a country, we risk a critical misunderstanding. If we only hear a single story about ourselves, we also miss a critical understanding of who we are as a people and a culture. If the Latricias of the world only hear, you have to lose weight because you're too big, you're black, you're this, you're that, that does a lot of work on her self-esteem. And I don't think that that's the intended outcome. Most of us who are working in this area really want to help people to live thriving kinds of lives. And again, that goes back to that fourth pillar of sustainability, in ways that are going to feed their moral, social, political, spiritual existence. And the way to do that is not to demonize and shame people, but rather to help talk with them about ways that you can move them to a more inclusive, a broader way of talking about their food versus the either or. As one set of scholars rightly acknowledge in their work on food choices, and they say, conceptualizing food choice is a complex process with a range of influences and values that are negotiated differently by diverse people in a variety of settings. When we recognize this, I think we will all be more holistic in our view of food practices and efforts to improve our own and other dietary behaviors. If, in fact, our goal really is to improve the lifeways of people and to assist in ensuring access, we need to consider heavily people's life courses and decisions, their options, their values, and the desires that are best for them. I really think that we need to stop policing the plate of others, and I'm working on a book on this right now about policing and shaming of foodways in African American communities. I think that if we're going to be humane and we're going to do the work that we are tasked to do, then policing and shaming other people around a set of objects that literally might hold them down culturally and therefore psychologically is absolutely not the thing that we want to do. Rather, what we want to do is help them to thrive and enjoy the lives that they have here on this earth. Thank you very much, and I'm open to any questions and conversation.
Thank you, Psyche, for that wonderful presentation. So we have a few questions that have come in, and for our audience, please feel free to submit more questions through the chat box. So the first question we have, can you offer some strategies to begin to discuss eating habits with adolescents and young adults who may be resistant to adopting new eating habits or exploring new types of food?
Yeah, I think this is a really popular question, and it's one that certainly as a parent I've dealt with. I think that sometimes the thing to do is to find the food that, especially young adolescents and children, find the food that they like. Many of them like chicken, right? That's a popular one. chicken, and then, sometimes corn is another one. And we have really, corn has become the death knell, quite frankly. But adding corn, adding tomatoes, and again, I recognize that there are going to be a lot of things that folks won't eat. My nephews only really want to eat pizza, and no matter how unhealthy that is, allowing them to experiment with other foods that they might want. For example, their mom is adamant that they won't eat beef, but maybe allowing them to try some foods like that. They may ultimately reject it. Their body may reject it. But I think that it begins to at least put in front of them some different options. There's also, potatoes. Again, allowing them to experiment with some of the basic foods that they would like to eat might be one way to go. What we tend to code it in that, and I'm not suggesting that that's the case here, but often coded in that kind of question is, my kids or the kids won't eat vegetables. Many adults don't eat vegetables either. And so it's a matter, I think, sometimes of figuring out different ways, maybe through spaghetti or some other kind of dish, of finding, and you hear this all the time, of finding ways to incorporate or hide the vegetables. And then over time, ultimately, as we have young adults growing into older adults, they're going to make the decisions that they want to make, and there's no way that you can force it. So the best you can do is allow them to have a range of things that they might try in hopes that one or two of them actually might stick. Honestly, there's no yes or no answer to that. There's nothing that I think is cut or dry.
Great, thank you. Okay, so another question we have is, have you found it helpful to share recipes with clients when talking about alternative ways of eating or cooking types of food that they already love?
I have, and I also find that the visuals work really well. For example, when I am talking with clients or when I am talking in communities and I show some of the pictures that I've just shown, that gets folks salivating, right? And for a lot of us, the visual is the most appealing, whether it's bodies or food. That's how we have this whole notion of food porn. When we start getting too complicated, that's when it makes people a little leery. So, for example, if I'm sharing with the client, let's try and reduce the amount of pork consumption and use more turkey, I would show that picture of the collard greens with the turkey. And now, how do you get to that? You have collard greens, you have smoked turkey, which you can get at your local grocery store or at a farmer's market in some cases, or Amish market. You boil the turkey, maybe chop up some onions, which won't be as heavily factored in that. You put in the collard greens, you put in a pinch of salt and pepper, and then you let it cook, maybe for about 45 minutes. Those are like five steps you can take to achieve some proximity or some semblance of that image you just saw. It's when we get into a lot of different measurements and a lot of different ingredients that people become very daunted. Few people know, for example, what a teaspoon or a tablespoon or a half a cup or a cup might be. And I understand we're dealing with health consequences. And so it's important that they have something of exact measurement. But if we know all the ways we've been taught, a deck of cards measures and equals this, visually, so forth and so on. But if you minimize the amount of ingredients that people have to use as well, I think you can go far. But yes, I have used recipes in these conversations.
Wonderful. Thanks. Another question we have here is, what are some recommendations that you would give to providers in working with low-income families around how they can incorporate healthier foods into their diet that they can afford?
Awesome. First of all, I think we have to interrogate what is meant by healthier, because that is a huge and broad concept. And so the first thing I would encourage the practitioner to do is ask their clients, your definition, their definition of healthy. Because what they might be thinking and what the practitioner is thinking could be completely different. The other thing you might consider is actually going with them to a local grocery store, or at least pointing them in the direction. Let's just start with one food. Let's not try to change the entire palette. Let's just start with one. Let's just incorporate collard greens, if you will. Or let's just try it with macaroni and cheese. Again, speaking to people where they are. I think sometimes the other daunting thing is to say, you have to change your diet. Where do you start? Do you start with the vegetables? Do you start with bread? Do you start with, sweet tea or Kool-Aid? Where do you start? Okay, so let's take some, you like the sweetness of tea and you like the sweetness of Kool-Aid. Let's take some of those fruit cups from Dole or Heinz or whomever, and let's pour the fruit cup, no sugar added, let's pour that into some water, and let's pour a couple of those in there and see what kind of taste you get. Maybe add a tea bag. Is it sweet, is that already flavoring the water or flavoring the tea? Again, just starting with one thing. And I recognize that we are all extremely busy in our jobs and with the tasks that we have been given. But I don't find in my research that a wholesale shift and change is good for anyone. In fact, part of what Oliver and Campos and others would argue is that fluctuation in weight up and down so dramatically is actually even more dangerous to your health than talking to a person about being obese. So you have them, they drop all of this weight, and then over time they're like, you know what, I don't really like what I don't really like this way of eating, where I had to completely change everything. But in low-income communities, okay, if you're going to be going to the corner store, what are you going to choose that you think represents what's healthy? Can you get canned fruit? If you get canned vegetables, we might have to wash off, rinse off the vegetables first before you make them. Having those kinds of different conversations versus you need to shift and change this or change that might go far toward helping a person feel that they are being heard and that their everyday lives are being taken into consideration. So again, small steps, changing one food group, whether it's what you're drinking or whether it's what they're drinking, or even if it's let's switch from white bread maybe to some, not completely into whole wheat, but, multigrain, and then we'll shift to whole wheat. So again, taking people through small stage steps. I'm not going to give up my mac and cheese. Okay, great. Let's look at using not 100% whole fat cheese, but maybe 2%. Again, small changes, but it's a reflection that you hear them. It's a reflection that you appreciate, I think, their cultural space, and that you appreciate and value the time, the knowledge, the skill, and so forth, as well as the taste that's going to go into this transformation.
Awesome. Thank you. And we have one more question that I think you hit on some points, but maybe you can expand a little bit more. How do you begin to explore culture and food with individuals who are struggling with health concerns related to health and weight?
Right. I think that one of the things that I would do is to ask them what foods make them happy? What foods do they enjoy? If, in fact, you're hearing, for example, if a person is saying, well, tamales is what makes me feel great, or fried chicken is what I enjoy. Okay, how then do we take that one food item and how you ask them, how can you modify it in a way that still gives you the taste, but it might not be as perhaps bad as what you as we see, or it may not affect your health as negatively as you're currently experiencing. I'm in the midst of this right now with a family member who loves ice cream, and yet they have diabetes, and a couple of weeks ago when they were in the hospital, their insulin, they had to keep getting insulin. They have been living with diabetes for about 50 years, controlling through diet and exercise, but what they found in the hospital is that is that the sugar level kept going up. Well, that's because while they were convalescing, they would walk by the little area in the hospital and pick up some graham crackers on the way back to the room. Okay, well, by the time they get back to the room and ate the graham crackers, their sugar was almost through the roof. It was certainly at least much, much higher than the hospital personnel wanted to see. And so they would then have to give, family members some insulin. When the family member came home, I said to my siblings, I said, we cannot wholesale just say you cannot have it. Just don't. Because when you do that, you can almost force a person in the opposite direction where they will overindulge because they feel deprived. So I went out and I looked at, I Googled online ice cream for diabetics, and there are several out there. Now, we can only go so far as to say, okay, here's the ice cream that we're going to get, and you enjoy one cup, and maybe you can add some strawberries, frozen strawberries, or whatever you want to add to it. After that, there's nothing much more you can do, because if they choose to go back and have 2 or 3 cups, all right, now I'm into policing. And certainly with adults, I don't think policing is the way to go. And then sometimes our policing can turn to shame and shaming. And I understand that. We get tired, we get frustrated, we get certainly irritated that our loved ones aren't taking the time that they need to help themselves. And yet we have to stop ourselves right there into the shaming, because they're going to be shamed enough when they start to feel the repercussions from that action. They may change, they may not. I'll give one other brief example. There's a great article that I often use about corner stores, and the scholar who was doing the research for months would watch people who came into the corner store market and watch what they bought and so forth and so on. One of the instances, a man came in and ordered fried chicken, and before he left, he proceeded to put a lot of salt on the chicken. And the woman behind the counter said, "Oh my God, you're gonna kill yourself. You can't have all that salt on your chicken or anything else." And his response was, "You know what? This is what makes me happy. I'm going to die anyhow. I might as well die eating what I want." Now, there are all kinds of concerns we might have with that logic. But I think this goes back to what I said at the end of the presentation. People are operating with compounding and multi-levels of stories, and they're competing and they're overlapping. We're not going to always be able to stop people from going down a road that they shouldn't go. The best we can do is offer them some options. And then if they choose not to take them, we actually have to value that they're making a particular choice. And then they have to live with that choice. When it comes to children, it's a little bit more difficult. But when we're dealing with adults, we absolutely must recognize that people's life courses, their decisions, their options, their values, and their desires are their own. And that's part of taking personal responsibility as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Psyche. That is the end of the Q&A section. I'm going to move to the next slide just to discuss some upcoming webinars offered by CTAC. Part of the Trauma-Informed Care series, we have 2 webinars coming up the next 2 months. On July 27th, we have Trauma-Informed Collaboration, as well as Trauma-Informed Supervision on August 24th. You can visit the Trauma-Informed Care series page on ctacny.com to learn more about those. And then part of the 0 Degrees of Separation series, the role of social determinants, we have the Seeds of Health, exploring the impact of social, economic, and educational determinants on August 10th. So please visit our website to register and learn a little bit more about those offerings. And lastly, here's some contact information. If you have any questions for CTAC or for Psyche, please email ctac.info@nyu.edu, and we'll make sure those questions are sent to the correct people. And lastly, I just wanted to thank everybody for joining today's webinar and for Psyche for providing us with this exceptional presentation. So thank you again, everyone. We hope to see you soon.